Morning Neuro Ninjas, welcome to today's wellbeing workout. It's a complex one today. We're going to focus on why do I have OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. And there are lots of complexities here and we're going to just give you an overview. But basically, obsessive compulsive disorder in all its many forms occurs because our mind-wandering network has got stuck in recursive loops, forcefully linking temporary feelings of relieving our anxiety with repeated actions that have nothing whatsoever to do with the source of the anxiety or relieving the anxiety. And involved in this is not just the mind-wandering network. There are bits of kit like the amygdala, for example, which is very focused on anything that changes in the world. And the amygdala is a really interesting structure because it's got effectively its own kind of memory. It's not memory that we can access. It's not explicit memory that we can talk about. It is memory of generally dangerous events that we need to take heed of in relation to survival. So we're going to explore this topic this morning. So the bits we're talking about are the mind-wandering network, which also involves circuits at the back of the brain in the visual cortex. But all of these bits, we're going to be talking about the amygdala a lot. The thalamus, the hypothalamus are involved. The thalamus is the sensory gate, so that allows senses and information from around the body to come in to the brain, except the sense of smell, which goes direct into the amygdala. The hypothalamus is an organ that is linked to the pituitary gland below it. It's going to release neuromodulators and hormones, particularly when we're feeling anxious. And then we've got two familiar parts of the prefrontal cortex, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex and the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex. Ventral medial, reactive, emotional reasoning. Dorsal lateral, more strategic. The site of metacognition, when we're talking about insight, that ability of the brain to look at itself from a slight distance and watch its own thoughts rather than just get lost in them. We're talking about circuits up there. So we need to remember the mind-wandering network as well. The mind-wandering network crosses around a vast range of different circuits in the brain. It's called the DMN by neuroscientists. That's the default mode network because it comes on by default. And circuits of executive function in that lilac area of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex use the mind-wandering network to problem solve. When we've got lots of problems and complexity, the DMN, the mind-wandering network, is stimulated to fire more often. And remember, we're in a neurally plastic brain. So it's really interesting because you'd think, wouldn't you, if you're trying to solve a problem, that you would want to silence your mind-wandering network and focus much more on thinking things through. But actually, the thinking things through process is actually supported massively by the mind-wandering network. Evolved probably during our ancestry when we were trying to process complex social information. So OCD happens when the amygdala initiates feelings of anxiety. So deep in the brain, if we remember where the amygdala is, it's down here. Feelings of anxiety are initiated when the amygdala spots some change, some event, some development in the world that doesn't match the brain's prediction. So when we come across change and uncertainty, we're going to feel feelings of anxiety. And any event in the present can evoke feelings of anxiety and uncertainty if it's similar to something that happened in the past as well. So it's a really complicated process in terms of the amygdala's firing pattern. So the amygdala's response is usually initiating some negative conversation with the circuits at the bottom of the prefrontal cortex. Something terrible will happen. The amygdala activates, and that is the general feeling as the bottom of the brain starts engaging in cognitive distortions. It's negatively predicting worst case scenarios, and we're feeling the three-dimensional experience of stress. So we might feel that in a clenched stomach, Our thoughts are whirling around, spiraling negatively, our heart's pumping. We're feeling really quite uncomfortable. And then at the top of the brain, in terms of OCD, circuits of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, in order to deal with the feelings of anxiety, come up with some random rule, like let's touch each door 3 times on the way out, and just the doing of that action, well, the doing of the action relieves a little bit of the stress because we're doing something. It helps us develop a sense of control, and actually just moving around is going to reduce some of that stress. And that erroneously, slowly but surely, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex links that action with the reduction in feelings of anxiety within whatever rule-based obsessions our brain is starting to develop. So we get an obsessive thought and we get a compulsive desire to carry out that thought. That's where you get the obsessive compulsive bit. So you get obsessive random rules your brain generates, and they can be random. We've worked with lots of different people with a range of different obsessions, and that drives a behaviour, generally a compulsion. And when we do the compulsion, that tends to relieve a little bit of that anxiety. So people that are experiencing lots of anxiety, have got some low level thrum of anxiety, may suffer hugely from OCD. And then what happens is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex feels a reduction in those feelings of anxiety and thinks, okay, I feel better. That must have worked. And that begins to tighten that loop of OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. Now, because the DLPFC's link with reduction of anxiety is erroneous, it's not actually reducing anxiety, having that obsession and that compulsion. The anxiety is being caused by either some event in the past. So for example, if someone's experienced a lot of trauma, they've been in an abusive relationship and they've escaped that abusive relationship, they might end up with lots of low-level anxiety all of the time, and then they'll develop obsessive compulsive responses to reduce that anxiety. So it's a response of the brain to try and reduce its own anxiety without actually reducing the source of the anxiety. And that might be, for example, the source of the anxiety that traumatic memories got stuck. Now, we've all heard of fake news. Our brain generates fake news based on its own internal biases as it responds to the complexity of the world. So a really good example is the way the brain spends a lot of its time looking in the world for cause and effect, because that had greater survival value. But many events in the world might occur at the same time, but the one event that occurred at the same time as the other event didn't cause it. So many events in the world just happen to correlate at the same time. They're not causative. So that can lead our brain to say daft things like everything happens for a reason. Whereas actually, if you think about that idea of everything happens for a reason, that's just not true, is it? It's just not true. Just think about all the awful things that happen in the world to people. It cannot be that everything happens for a reason. Brains generate reasons for everything because that gives us a sense of control. It's fake news. So we really need to challenge those sorts of biases. And that issue of everything happens for a reason, that kind of link that we make, is effectively where superstitions come from. And we're not the only animal that is superstitious. It goes across the animal kingdom.
"60 years ago, the American psychologist B.F. Skinner investigated the behavior of pigeons, rewarding them with food when they learnt to peck a key in the feeding apparatus. But then Skinner set the apparatus to reward the birds at random. Now the pigeons just had to sit back and wait. But that isn't what they did. Instead, the majority developed what Skinner called superstitious behavior. When an individual pigeon, for example, happened to look over its left shoulder, and the reward mechanism just happened to click in at that point, it would have got the idea that it was looking over the left shoulder that had got it the reward, so it tried it again. By sheer luck, as it happened, the reward mechanism delivered food at the same time again. And so the pigeon was reinforced in its idea that looking over the left shoulder was what got it the reward. And it went on and turned into a maniac for looking over the left shoulder. Humans can be no better than pigeons. We constantly create false positives. We touch wood for luck, see faces in toasted cheese, fortunes in tea leaves.
So that link between an event occurring at the same time as another event, that link the brain might make, can often be a false positive. And that's a perfect example of what's happening in OCD. So we're feeling anxious for some other reason. The top of the brain tries to reduce that anxiety with an obsessive thought and a compulsion to act in a particular way as a result of that thought. And that tends to reduce the anxiety a little bit because we're distracting ourselves from the circuits that are firing. And also we're doing something that reduces some of the stress. Now the source of obsessive compulsive disorders are versions of these cognitive distortions, those highly negative worst case scenarios the reactive circuits can build. And at the top of the brain is trying to resolve some of those highly negative worst case scenarios, because if we're feeling anxious, our brain will generate lots of cognitive distortions. This awful thing will happen if I don't do this thing, because we're responding to those feelings of anxiety. And they're not just thoughts, they are very strong feelings involving hormones like cortisol and adrenaline released by the hypothalamus. So information might come in through the senses that triggers anxiety through the thalamus. The hypothalamus will release some of those hormones, and we're experiencing these symptoms of sympathetic nervous system activation, and we get stuck in cycles of OCD as the top of our brain tries to calm all that down from the top, with an erroneous link between the anxiety and those actions, those obsessions. So let's just talk about a person that we worked with a few years ago, and I've changed her name and I have checked with her that it's all right to tell this story. She's really keen actually for you to know this story. So let me just tell you the story of Anna. When she was a toddler, she experienced a really difficult moment in McDonald's when she was around about 2 years old. Her parents were having a big argument. It was a tricky relationship and ultimately they ended up getting divorced, but it was a really difficult, shouty argument in McDonald's, so much so that members of staff had to kind of intervene because it was getting a little bit tetchy and potentially it looked as if it might go violent. Now, at the time that her parents were arguing and shouting, as she's a toddler just eating her fries, she'd managed to cover herself up in ketchup. She'd covered herself in ketchup, got over her fingers, all over her mouth, and her parents, really angry at each other, had a big shout at her because the anger was going in a range of different directions. It was really tricky, a really difficult experience, but it was an event actually that became Anna's first real memory. Now that's quite sad, but actually if you think about it, many of our first memories are either very, very positive experiences or very, very negative experiences, because the amygdala and the memory system remembers things that are dangerous and also emotionally salient. So both of those would link to that experience. It felt quite a difficult, upsetting experience, potentially dangerous experience, and it was emotionally salient. So she's got her hands covered in sticky ketchup. She's feeling really, really anxious. Then we start working with her. We're starting working with her 15 years later. So she's a university student at this point, and she's suffering from crippling anxiety and massive OCD. Lots of complicated routines of OCD. And one of the key areas was hand washing. There was lots and lots and lots of hand washing, particularly around illness, but actually just this pervasive feeling of anxiety. So been working with her 5 or 6 months, not really managed to crack the OCD, had a few goes at it, but we were working very much on supporting her study as well. And then we just happened to be having a conversation. And remember, our work isn't about therapy, so it's not therapy. We're just talking about memories, and we were talking about first memories. And Anna happened to mention this event. And the AYP coach just had a bit of a think about it for a second and just thought, hang on a second, that event, let's hypothesise for a second, that event with sticky hands covered in tomato ketchup, feeling lots and lots of anxiety, lots and lots of anxiety. And then this hand washing link. Now, whenever Anna was around people that were unwell, whenever she felt kind of dirty, she would feel really anxious and she would wash her hands. And the anxiety, we've begun to realise, was kind of there linked to kind of this sense of contamination, of dirt. So that could be contamination from an illness, contamination from sort of dirt on her hands, etc. If you touched a doorknob, she'd need to wash her hands, etc. And we started to run this hypothesis. I mean, you can never ultimately know, because this memory happened when she was 2 and we're obviously not able to get access to all the details of it. But if the hypothesis is that if Anna has got dirty hands covered in ketchup and she's feeling massively anxious at that point, the anxiety has become linked as a result of dirty hands. So if you've got dirty hands, you feel anxiety. And then at the top of the brain, later on, as she's heading into kind of university exams, she's experiencing anxiety for a whole range of reasons. The exams obviously themselves generate anxiety. And whenever she is concerned and feeling anxious, she washes her hands, she washes her hands, she washes her hands, she washes her hands. So we've begun to kind of break the loop. And what we did, sounds slightly unhinged, but what we did was we said, well, actually, let's just test the theory. So let's just go back to the original event that we think it might be, and let's put some tomato ketchup on your hands. Just put some tomato ketchup on your hands and see what happens. Put some tomato ketchup on your hands, and because her hands are dirty, she's feeling really anxious. And we said, well, just see how long you can manage breathing exercises, etc., with those feelings of anxiety. The obsessional thoughts came, the compulsion to wash the hands, and obviously, once those thoughts had risen, she washed her hands, cleared the tomato ketchup off. But that was the moment where it was a eureka moment, and whether or not it was actually linked to that event, the talking around that began to break that cycle for Anna. She began to think, hang on a sec, I can retrain my amygdala. So she just did some tomato ketchup exposure therapy, covering her hands with tomato ketchup and just lasting a little bit longer before doing the obsessive compulsive. And that broke the cycle. She was able to begin to change the rules of her brain slowly but surely. That's just one case. Every single person's version of OCD is a little bit different. Some people find it extremely comforting, particularly people that have been through really difficult experiences can find OCD is really helpful in terms of managing anxiety. But the issue with it is, because every brain can generate obsessive compulsive responses, just like that pigeon's brain, we can make links between events that aren't actual links. It's when it becomes debilitating, it becomes that kind of disorder. So we can support you with OCD. We can support you to begin that process of managing obsessive thoughts by going through a process of looking at the experience, beginning to understand anxiety, getting curious about the anxiety, building in a range of different responses, perhaps beginning to tweak the rules. Now, obviously, the detail of every individual journey is different, but the process of metacognition is extremely powerful in beginning to break that cycle. So that's the end of today's Wellbeing Workout. Thanks so much for joining us. If these are experiences you're having and your organisation subscribes to our support, get in touch and we'll start supporting you to manage and respond to